I did.
So the 40 spots for the brewery side are.
Remember, there's all those posts in the MontaNIKA chat.
You have that
Like
building.
meeting everyone.
No, I don't think it's all
For like days.
And
then-
I do want to.
And then,
Okay.
so I think it should be fine.
Oh, yeah,
Just come
I will.
if you want.
Let's go maybe here and hang out. I mean, there's no difference. There's an outdoor patio and stuff too. It's probably gonna be packed.
I don't know what time he's arriving,
And random people.
Yeah.
but he will be at Headwaters.
Yes.
Headwaters Craft
I-
House. For those that don't drink alcoholic beverages, they have really good root beer and salt, non-alcoholic seltzers. So
Yeah.
is that you? It's amazing how many texts I'm getting. Who's a 503? 509?
I'm 509, but that's probably, I don't remember. I don't have your number, so that's not me.
Well, let's begin. Welcome to Orthodox MontaNIKA. So excited you guys are here. Let this be the first of many wonderful experiences. I put it together. It fell together in a happy accident, but I feel that was really blessed by the Lord. And part of this is to announce, not only expose people to the potentials of Orthodoxy and its growth in Montana itself. We're a state the size, basically just shy of California, with only 1 million people, and we have what, 7 parishes now, 6 or 7 throughout. Six throughout, and 1 monastery. And so I want to give you a feel of what the potential Montana has, especially for Orthodox, the sorts of communities that we can come together in intentional kind of communities and grow Orthodoxy. It's ripe for it. So I think this is a wonderful place for all of you to experience some of those people here. Might also want to flee their totalitarian states. You are welcome here after the vetting process that Jay and I have. But the other thing too is a lot of us speakers, so we have Jay Dyer, we have Michael and David. We have more that unfortunately could not get the logistics to work out to make it. But what we had a vision that we really wanted to, we're all doing apologetics and ministry in different ways. And as far as the audience and potential converts and even catechumens in Orthodox, they might know 1 or 2 of us as content providers, but we're all working together. We're giving referrals to, and I thought, well, how great would it be if we consolidated all our powers onto a single apologetics webpage that sources out, so it'd be like a competition to AFR, right? Where all the apologists you could look up, and also in such a way that we're not overlapping each other's streams. Think about the amazing work that God could do through us if we did that. So I'd like to announce, obviously there's more content providers like Rouge and others that are going to be working with us, but this is kind of an announcement that we're officially launching our apologetics. We've already had so much success, both through our Discord and each and every one of your platforms in the content. And, glory to God for all of your work. And I thank all of you and bringing people into the kingdom. It's bearing good fruits. I'm sure there's things we're always going to learn and get better at, but that's part of this Orthodox MontaNIKA, is to announce that we're all consolidating our powers. We're going to make a wonderful Orthodox apologetics program. So thank you for all your support, especially the content providers, and God bless you in your work. So let's just open with prayer and then I'll begin, and then we can do Q&A. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, into ages of ages. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through the prayers of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy upon us and save us. Amen. So, of course, you know me, I have a controversial topic for you. In whom do you put your trust? An orthodox analysis of COVID science. So that's why we're not going to do this on YouTube, because we'd all lose our channels. So this paper investigates the conditions of knowledge pertaining to science, distinguishing genuine science from pseudoscience as it particularly relates to COVID-19. I discussed the relationship between science and socio-political structures, illustrating how science can be corrupted into scientism. I argue that the current dominating ideology of technocracy, which is identified as a modern form of Gnosticism, it's incompatible with Christianity, since it sees the cosmos not as a divine order, but a man-made system created by a will to power, dominate man and nature. And I show that this Promethean rebellion against God results in a Nietzschean deicide and Gnostic recreation of the order of being that leads to the current technocratic totalitarianism and corrupted science concerning COVID-19. And since everybody presupposes something, as various pre-commitments informing beliefs and approaching factual questions and observing evidence, etc., we will explore the necessary preconditions and commitments for the possibility of knowledge. That sounds familiar, right? That's my jam there. But particularly as concerning science, this will serve to illustrate how beliefs, ideologies, paradigms, theories, and socio-political structures influence and often corrupt science. Therefore, this approach will therefore be, in this paper, a presuppositional analysis of the dominating ideologies and socio-political structures in which science is now operating that leads to the corrupted science and scientism we're currently experiencing with COVID-19. Scientific knowledge. Before proceeding to discuss science in what's called the demarcation problem, distinguishing science from pseudoscience, let us briefly mention various types of knowledge and reasoning. This will help to illustrate where science stands in terms of knowledge and when science ceases being science and becomes scientism. Traditionally, there's two standard forms of knowledge and reasoning: deductive reasoning and inductive. The methodology in the empirical sciences is primarily based on induction and is known as inductivism, the approach whereby scientific laws are inferred from particular facts or observational evidence. Therefore, scientific theories are inferred by reasoning from particular facts to general principles. The problem, however, is that this type of reasoning, ignoring Hume's problem of induction right now, for the moment, simply amounts to things being probabilistic, assuming we could even establish such reasoning as actual knowledge. That would only count as the lowest type of knowledge, probabilistic knowledge. More devastating critiques are David Hume's problem with induction, which shows that causality cannot be derived from sense experience. And thus the principle of uniformity of nature cannot be justified from empirical grounds, since science grounded induction is based on deriving facts from experience, and because it assumes the future will resemble the past, the principle of the uniformity of nature, the belief in the validity of induction and that nature is uniform will end up being fallacious assumptions that beg the question, i.e., right, circular reasoning, and are therefore unjustified. Now, of course, the alternatives is to turn to Karl Popper's theory, which argues that scientists don't need to use induction, since the criterion of falsification makes reasoning from experience deductively valid. However, we've got a problem here. Falsificationalism is fraught with its own problems, and it simply just moves the question back again further, that the epistemological question that will inevitably beg the question on more fundamental epistemological considerations. How do they justify that criteria for their justification criteria? Another instance of circular reasoning, or what we in philosophy call epistemic bootstrapping, returning to the idea, another instance of returning to the idea of inductivism, by which laws of nature are formulated on the basis of factual evidence. Well, there's problems with the very concept of factual evidence and the idea that science just proceeds by accumulation of facts, right? Everybody knows that. Well, if we read Thomas Kuhn's The Theory of the Structures of the Scientific Revolution, for example, we find the history of science does not proceed by simply collecting more and more facts, as if we were ever approaching a more and more accurate view of reality in the world. Rather, science always proceeds by first assuming the paradigm or overall theory, such that evidence now becomes what we call paradigm relative and incommensurate actually with other scientific paradigms or theories. Kuhn shows that, well, this happens not by way of evidence. It's not like we're just getting more evidence and more evidence, but by something akin to a revolution, a coup d'etat, in with the out, right? Out with the old, in with the new. So what does that mean? Well, in other words, factual evidence and what counts as facts is relative and dependent upon theory. A change in theory will change facts. This is an indication that an epistemological analysis of evidence must occur not at the bottom, at the evidentiary considerations, but at the paradigm level. Furthermore, even within a single theory, it's not clear what constitutes facts, since only facts that one could agree on are independent of scientific theory are those from sense experience, immediately present to the individual. However, the problem here is that basically takes facts out of the objective public realm and makes them entirely private and subjective. In addition to the problems of establishing what constitutes facts and that science does not proceed by accumulation of facts, there are difficulties with the incommensurance of scientific paradigms and theories, which even includes our current and various current scientific theories. This is something that not only Kuhn alluded to in his two dogmas of empiricism, and was able to demonstrate. It's not something that only that Kuhn realized, but it was also described in detail by Wilfred van Orman Quine in his two dogmas of empiricism, who was able to demonstrate we're simply unable to derive our science or confirm any scientific theory or paradigm from sense experience. He and Duhem, in what is called the Quine-Duhem theory of the undetermination of data thesis, revealed that our data, our sense experience and observations, can all fit and support multiple conflicting scientific theories or paradigms. That's to say, the available evidence at any given time will be insufficient for determining which one of those theories is actually true or what you should adopt. Therefore, the science is indeed underdetermined by the evidence or data. What this reveals is that there are multiple scientific theories all conflicting with each other that will all fit the evidence and data. Well, then they can't all be said to describe reality accurately, right? And truly. at the same time. This is what leads, among other things, to many philosophers of science to reject scientific realism in favor of something either called anti-realism or metaphysical quietism, or something called instrumentalism. Quine, Duham, Loudon, Putnam, Fine, Fairbairn, Dewey, et al., they're all in this camp. And they think science, hey, it's not metaphysics, it's not ontology, right, as far as, i.e. reality. Well, what is it then? Well, given the aforementioned problems in science with the incommensurateness of paradigms and the underdetermination of data, many have argued for science being a praxis, oasis, right? A knowledge, it is a type of knowledge, but it's a knowledge concerned with doing, making, producing. Here's a better word for you, methodology, right? Rather than theoria, a knowledge about ontology or metaphysics. Many philosophers are inclined to move science out of that ontological and metaphysical sphere and commit oneself to something like metaphysical quietism or instrumentalism, since science is concerned with doing and making, like a tool, on the Greek word techne, right? The tool of the artisan to do something. It's argued that science shouldn't be concerned so much with describing reality, ontology, or metaphysics, which is what the vulgar often take it to be. One doesn't go into their toolbox and pick up your screwdriver and to find a commentary, a metaphysical commentary about the cosmos, right? Speak to me, what's the reality of why? Because that's not what tools are for in your toolbox. They have something to do with reality, but what they typically have to do with reality is concerned with making, doing, producing, achieving a certain kind of end and goal. And it's not, it's your screwdriver and hammer isn't in the business of metaphysics and ontology. Scientific theories, scientific facts, laws, etc., are argued in this sense to be no truer than and describe reality anymore accurately than do our screwdrivers or hammers. Rather than thinking that each statement, i.e. the atom of a nucleus, that statement maps onto reality in a one-to-one correspondence, which would be what we call in philosophy of science the naive realist or verificationist view, Quine suggests that our statements about the external world face a tribunal of experience, sense experience, not individually, but as a corporate body. Here he's thinking about a paradigm, right? The overall paradigm. In other words, statements only have their meaning, speaking scientifically in this sense, within the greater kind of fabric or web of beliefs, of language, structures, and paradigms. In fact, he says it's better to think of these entities, properties, laws like atoms, electrons, and things like that as sort of like mythological characters that you posit in a story to make sense of the overall story or scientific paradigm. Now, look, whether you take a realist view, a critical realist view, an instrumentalist or a metaphysical quietist position on science, why do I bring up all this stuff about philosophy of science? Well, from a survey of the literature, at least it shows you that science does not reach the level that the vulgar and those committed to scientism really think that it does. This has particular significance for our considerations on COVID science, since most who support the official stance on COVID together with their prescribed recommendations often ascribe a greater epistemic status to science than it actually really has. One of the issues that plague our common and contemporary views of science, a factor that often leads to scientism, is that fundamental confusion between methodology, methods for obtaining desired results, and ontology, i.e. reality. Because of the pragmatic success of science methodology, many are led to think that science has an exalted, objective, and comprehensive knowledge of the world. However, the pragmatics of methodology do not necessarily equate to the knowledge of reality, i.e. just because it works doesn't mean that it's true. As we have seen from the Quine-Duham underdetermination data thesis, you can have multiple conflicting scientific paradigms and theories whose individual methodologies all work and whose descriptions all fit the appearances and data out there, but nevertheless still wouldn't be true. Why? Because given the fact that they're contradicting each other. In conclusion, since as Michael Polanyi states, quote, the premises of science on which all scientific teaching and research rest are the beliefs held by scientists on the general nature of things. Well, we're brought back to our initial considerations on how various beliefs and ideologies on the socio-political structures influence and even corrupt science and turn science into scientism. As Anthony O'Hare points out, quote, much of what scientists tell us of these things inevitably goes way beyond anything we have evidence for. Any evidence we have is necessarily drawn from a tiny part of the whole universe and may not be representative or indicative of the whole, end quote. Taking this in conjunction with how science has currently been elevated to the status of absolute truth, we have reason to suspect that what is being presented with the COVID science may be corrupted into scientism. Therefore, let's turn our attention to scientism, shall we? Systems have arisen in history where science ceased being science, yet nevertheless operated under the guise of science. Eric Voegelin identifies both Marxism and National Socialism, although not limited to these alone, are just such systems. In such socio-political structures, the society at large and the majority of scientists in those societies, they remove God as the intelligible ground of being. That thing, that necessary precondition that would actually ground and make science a scientia, a knowledge. And they begin to create speculative enterprises and systems that make certain questions practically or conceptually impossible. For example, Karl Marx, in his concealment of his Gnostic speculation, Voegelin says, takes on the appearance and form of an intellectual swindle. Voegelin states, quote, Marx's prohibition of questions has to be characterized as an attempt to protect the intellectual swindle of his speculation from the exposure by reason. But from the standpoint of the adept Marx, the swindle was the truth that he had created through his speculation, and the prohibitions of questions was designed to defend the truth of the system against the unreason of men, end quote. Recent questions also have become prohibited. Are questions about, well, what makes science actually science? Other conceptually impossible actions within the neo-Gnostic systems include questions of settled science. Well, we all know, all the science know, right? It's settled. Well, if answers are given, it's often, right, if you do ask, well, those answers are met with another expected explanation that can either be verified or falsified. But if that occurs, that science is incapable of being falsified, then we're moving out of the realm of science and into the realm of pseudoscience. Voegelin goes on to argue that this takes on a religious quality and becomes known as scientism. Augusto Del Noce points out that, quote, the distinctive ideology of the technological society is scientism, the view that science as the only true knowledge, end quote. This, he argues, inevitably leads to a technocratic totalitarianism. He states, quote, now an advocate of scientism in society based on this way of thinking cannot help but being totalitarian as much of his conception of science cannot, at this, be the object of any proof. He does not intend to elevate other forms of thought to a higher level, but simply denies them, end quote. In scientism, not only are non-falsifiable methods employed, the totalitarian tactic of social feeling, social think, right? You know that, which can be enforced through media, education, politics, corporations, the state, et cetera, is used to enforce what? The settled science, right? In fact, both the positivists and the founders of scientism, Saint Simon and Comte, advocated for the use of social feeling tactics to subordinate individuals and ideologically conform them to the new system in the name of progress. Sound familiar? Voegelin identifies these things as essential components of a Gnostic system and key features of scientism. Well, look, there's a definite link between scientism and technocracy. We got this quote here from Neil Postman, who states, quote, By scientism, I mean three interrelated ideas that taken together stand as one of the pillars of technopoly. One, the methods of the natural sciences can be applied to the study of human behavior. Two, social science generates specific principles which can be used to organize society on rational and humane basis. This implies that technical means, mostly invisible technologies, supervised by experts, can be designed to control human behavior and set it on the proper course. And three, faith in science can serve as a comprehensive belief system that gives meaning to life, as well as a sense of well-being, mortality, and even immortality, end quote. Now, what should be concerning to all of us is we're finding these exact same elements going in attitudes amidst the COVID science. In fact, it's something that actually I would say existed prior to the virus, the settled science of climate change and nutrition. Although there may be scientists who believe in God, the overwhelming majority of scientists and the system itself in which science actually operates on definitely secular atheistic assumptions. This current system is historically situated in a post-Enlightenment, technocratic, Gnostic, socio-political structure. Furthermore, as the philosopher of science Anthony O'Hare points out, quote, if science itself can take on some characteristics of mythology, it's also true that science, being part of culture produced by human beings, cannot remain immune from other cultural and ideological influences, end quote, and will inevitably be shaped by technocratic ideas and powers. Therefore, let us look at the various epistemological techniques that to determine the trustworthiness of certain scientific claims and see how certain ideologies and power structures can corrupt science and even medicine. Call this my epistemic litmus test for good science. Philosophers often will propose thought experiments and scenarios that, although may never be encountered in real life or even remotely possible, nevertheless serve as epistemic tools to derive certain principles, confirm or falsify various theories, test hypotheses, etc. For example, we only need to think about Descartes, right? And his evil demon thought experiment to illustrate that this served not to confirm that he actually believed there was an evil demon doing all this stuff, right? This all-powerful evil demon, but rather an attempt to show that even under the worst case scenario, there were things that could or could not be known with certainty. Now, taking that in conjunction with something like Karl Popper's falsification principle, the attempt to disprove one's theory rather than confirm it, we might find a helpful heuristic in establishing whether we can actually trust the COVID science being presented to us. So let us assume the worst case scenario, which I'll actually argue later we have evidence for, and see if the monopolized narrative and aggressively forced propaganda concerning COVID science is trustworthy. Now consider the following epistemic litmus test put in the form of a question to actually determine how would we know if something is good science or not? Special methodology, unique insight, and appeal to distinct privileged paradigms would you as an individual scientist have or use that would have allowed you to know that what was being purported to be science, either in the National Socialist regime or Stalin's Russia or any Marxist regime, for example, was in fact science, or whether the science had actually been corrupted through the dominating ideologies and propaganda. What would make you unique and distinct from all the rest of the people and scientists to actually know that all those guys, right, that agree the science, well, hey, it's settled. It's true, it's authoritative. What special position would you have? Why are you different from everybody else? Okay. And provide justification for carrying out, for example, that science, some extreme things, right? If you remember our history, all in the name of the common good. Now ask yourself, how do you know that you're not actually in a similar situation? How would you know? Will the science reveal that to you? I'd argue that scientists are in the worst position to determine this. How do I know? Well, look at history, right? Furthermore, what would be the evidence for the trustworthy of such an official scientific stance, i.e. evidence that wouldn't be question-begging? What do I mean by that? Well, you're citing those scientists or doctors are precisely the ones in question to prove that those doctors or scientists are trustworthy. It's like, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. That's circular reasoning. And how would you argue that those explanations supporting the official narrative simply weren't something akin to a non-falsifiable conspiracy theory, right? How would you do that? Now, keep in mind, these questions are created and designed to create a healthy introspection to oneself so that you can start asking yourself important epistemological questions about the nature of trust and raise questions about, well, can the current COVID science it's operating, can it operate properly as science? Going forward, we can use similar techniques employed by detectives or prosecutors to determine the trustworthiness of a person or group and apply these techniques to the COVID science narrative as well. Let's call these techniques Detective Epistemology 101. Thank you for coming to Detective Epistemology Class 101. But before we begin those and go into those techniques, let's turn our attention to the topic of technocracy. What is it? What is technocracy? The seeds of technocracy begin with Saint Simon and Comte's positivism and their scientism. However, the overall ideas begin much earlier than Saint Simon and Comte. We see a radical shift in both thinking and orientation that occurs in modernity and the Enlightenment, which includes how man sees and approaches technology and even defines knowledge. For example, it's Francis Bacon who famously declared that, quote, human knowledge and human power are the same thing, or where the cause is not known, the effect cannot be produced, end quote. Not only is knowledge redefined purely in pragmatic and predictive effects, a new science, a new morality, aesthetics, philosophy is created, in short, a new world. As Philip Sherrard states, quote, when Bacon concluded in his Novum Organum that should apply not only to natural, but to all the sciences, including ethics and politics, and that it is to embrace everything, he opened the road for an all-inclusive scientific takeover of our culture and for the urban industrialism, which is its brainchild, end quote. This Baconian prescription for the total scientificization of our world is exactly what he was talking about. In his New Atlantis, Bacon conceived of a new social order dedicated to the expansion of modern science and progress in human achievement through dominion over nature. Nevertheless, the modern project in mechanization is perfected in the lights of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, whose projects only accept universal quantitative approach to everything and the application of mathematical techniques to all of nature. In this new social order, anything that does not submit to this universal quantitative project simply was not science. Sherrard explains, quote, what could not be caught in the net of numbers was non-science, non-knowledge, and even in the end, non-existent. This, end quote, together with the revolutionary spirit of the new man, who in his pretended autonomy revolted against heaven. That resulted, quote, in a period that is characterized by the ever-increasing dominance of anthropocentric forms of political speculation as opposed to theocentric questions, end quote. Mircea Eliade himself defined modern societies as, quote, those which have pushed the secularization of life and the cosmos far enough, end quote. In modernity, as typified by the Enlightenment thinking of Kant, not only must nature and her laws be conceived as radically autonomous from God, the Promethean rebellion against God must apply to the human wills. Both nature and the human will are now conceived to be radically autonomous from God. Autonomous mechanized nature leaves man without any objective meaning or grounding in the transcendent. is Dr. Bruce Seraphim Foltz, a colleague and friend of mine, concludes, quote, such a world offers no inner resistance to manipulation and control, presents no grain against which we ought not to cut, in Heidegger's words. It's a world that has become an inventory, a resource, in German Bestand, for technological control of consumption, end quote. Technology, therefore, is now being used as the sole means to perfect, to actually exploit nature and to create man and society according to the Gnostic, atheistic, and ideas of trying to perfect that human experience without grounding it in the living God is the unconditioned grounds of being. Well, how does this conception of technology relate to the idea of technocracy? The political power of the state, the secular state, which attempts to maintain a canonical morality over a relativistic and nihilistic culture that all embraces a plurality of moralities, yay, right? Well, that's been exchanged for a new Atlantis. Political institutions, as John Gunnell points out, have begun to be replaced by a parliament of technical experts. The elite class is called the technocrats. The technocratic image now replaces the politician and provides mankind with a vision of an industrial society where an elite class of engineers, scientists, and industrialists and planners systematically apply their technical knowledge to solutions, social problems, and the creation of a new rational social order. Much of their ideas have actually, on social engineering techniques, social physics are currently being employed amidst our current science. The technocratic theory and ideology is further promulgated and articulated by the following important intellectuals. I cite for you Max Weber, Karl Mannheim, Edward Bellamy, Bertrand Russell, Arthur Koestler, Brzezinski, et al. However, the term technocracy originated with an engineer in 1919 named William Smith and became popularized in an idea that responds to the Great Depression, a movement John Gunnell explains that for a time gained considerable notoriety and a substantial following. It began with a group of technicians and engineers dedicated to social reform, whose concepts were modeled on the technological republic of Edward Bellamy's late 19th century utopian novel, Looking Backward. They were also influenced by the economic theories of Thorstein Veblen and the principles of scientific management growing out of the work of Frederick W. Taylor, both of which suggested, much like the latter work of James Burnham in the Managerial Society, that politicians and industrial entrepreneurs should and would give way to technical elites. C.P. Snow, who dramatically pursued the problem of influence of experts on political decisions, argued that one of the most bizarre features of any advanced industrial society in our time is that the cardinal choices have to be made by a handful of men in a world of closed politics and secret scientific choices where there is no appeal to a larger assembly in the sense of group of opinion or electorate. Technocracy is intrinsically linked to the socio-political system, policy making in unique and interesting ways. John Gunnell explains technocracy's relation to politics as follows. One, in circumstances in which political decisions necessarily involve specialized knowledge and the exercise of technical skills, political power tends to gravitate towards technological elites. Two, technology has become autonomous, hence politics has become a function of systemic structural determinants over which it has little or no control. Three, technology and science constitute a new legitimating ideology that subtly masks certain forms of domination, end quote. Again, much of this goes back to Saints Simon and Comte's positivism. Concerning Saints Simone and Dante Germino explains, there was an obsession, a mania for system construction, characteristic of the 19th century in particular. He was obsessed with reducing all explanations, all principles to a single overarching formula. He said there can only be one science, one government, one religion. Does this sound familiar, right? It's bizarre that they were in back this. One organization of social classes. Saint Simon's progressivism, socialism, and positivism would all coalesce into the ideology of scientism, providing the technological managerial ruling elite of the future technocracy with its own religion. And as H.G. Wells, if any of you know, predicts, the technological elite can use religion for social domination to control populations and the socio-political structures. So see God, the invisible king. The underlying condition that allows a technocracy to come into being and corrupt science, control policy making, manipulate research, and result in certain forms of social domination is the scientism that arises from modernity. However, before getting into how technocracy specifically ties into the current science regarding COVID, let's turn back to those kind of epistemological concerns about evidence, trust, and justification. Next section, establishing trustworthiness. In 1976, the swine flu infected 230 soldiers at Fort Dix, resulting in 1 death. And they appealed to the 1918 Spanish flu, the fear that there would be a similar pandemic, which resulted in a vaccine being fast-tracked in the corporate medical institution with the help of the government instructing all Americans to get vaccinated. After 45 million Americans were vaccinated, the next few years produced 4,000 Americans filing vaccine damage claims, with the federal government totaling $3.2 billion, 300 deaths attributed to the vaccine, several hundred cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, as well as healthy 20-year-olds ending up as paraplegics. All this despite the fact that the death count never rose above 1. Now you find something similar with the H5N1 bird flu scare of 2005. Recall President George Bush declared that 2 million people are going to die, and you're out of which that's were terrorists, right? Now, they're going to die of the bird flu. How many? 2 million. However, despite all the hysteria and fears, only 98 people died globally in 2005, and another 115 the following year, revealing the bird flu not actually to be a pandemic. What did result from the hysteria was a surprise. Fast-track procedures for licensing and approval of pandemic vaccines created by the WHO. The WHO? The WHO. Here's a quote from the WHO regarding this. Ways were sought to shorten the times between the emergence of pandemic virus and availability of safe and effective vaccines, end quote. It was during the H5N1. Sound familiar? We also have had the swine flu scare of 2009, and we're warned that it could kill up to 90,000 Americans and hospitalize 2 million. However, like the aforementioned cases, those fears did not materialize. Again, what did materialize was the CDC's push for swine flu shots for everyone, despite the severity of the swine flu being moderate, most often not requiring medical care or hospitalization. Now, I argue we're seeing the exact same pattern with the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, just as in legal cases, we need to determine if there's a possible motive in all these cases to explain the same recurring pattern of behavior. In other words, who stands to benefit from all this overreaction and fear-mongering? Well, what's clear is that big pharma and big tech, which form essential parts of the technocracy, have benefited. And therefore, we actually have a potential motive for overinflating numbers, creating fear, excessive governmental control, and the suppression or censoring of any evidence that would contradict that such events are actually pandemics, or that they're actually safer and more effective treatments other than big pharma's prescribing and putting on the market. In fact, we have Johns Hopkins University ruling that COVID deaths have been manipulated and exaggerated. And I've got the quote from that from Johns Hopkins itself, which confirms the same pattern that we've noticed with those hysterics of past supposed pandemics. Therefore, let us take a look at the relationship now between drug companies and the medical community to see how the corruption of science and medicine can actually occur. The cronyism between drug companies, i.e. big pharma, and the medical and research establishments and government is a major source of corruption that often prevents us from doing good science and practicing acceptable medicine. We will see soon how this is tied to technocracy and the managerial ruling elite. But Dr. Marcia Angel, MD, former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, well, that's one of the most prestigious medical journals, wrote an article in January of 2009 entitled "Drug Companies and Doctors: Historic Corruption," that examines how corporate academic liaisons have corrupted the integrity of medicine. As pointed out earlier, there are incentives and motives for drug companies to promote or even lie about drugs, exaggerate diseases, promulgate fears about diseases in order to financially benefit from sales of the drugs. Since drug companies provide the major funding for research, Dr. Angel argues that drug companies can easily introduce bias and corrupt the integrity of medicine and science. She states, quote, "Because drug companies insist as a condition of providing funding that they be intimately involved in all aspects of the research they sponsor, they can easily introduce bias in order to make their drugs look better and safer than they really are. For the 1980s, they generally gave faculty investigators total responsibility for the conduct of the work, but now company employees or their agents often design the studies, perform the analysis, write the papers, and decide whether and in what form to publish the results," end quote. This results, as Dr. Angel argues, in scientists and medical faculty being, quote, "little more than hired hands, supplying patients and collecting data according to the instructions from the company," end quote. This manufactured control and conflicts of interest leads to further problems in the scientific and medical communities, which we can see relates directly for the push for the mRNA gene therapy vaccines and the suppression of alternative medicines and treatments. For example, quote, "The industry-sponsored trials published in medical journals consistently favors sponsors drugs, largely because negative results are not published. Positive results are repeatedly published in slightly different forms, and a positive spin is put even on negative results," end quote. Dr. Angel goes on to point out that just in psychiatry, quote, "A review of 74 clinical trials of antidepressants, for example, found that 37 of the 38 positive studies were published. But of the 36 negative studies, 33 either were not published or were published in a form that conveyed a positive outcome. It's not unusual," she says, "for a published paper to shift the focus from the drug's intended effect to a secondary effect that seems more favorable," end quote. This corruption inevitably leads to physicians practicing what she says a very drug-intensive style of medicine. Even when changes in lifestyle, she says, would be more effective, doctors and their patients often believe that for every ailment and discontent, there's a possible drug. We're seeing that exact same corruption going on surrounding COVID-19, where possible alternatives to what are known to be new and dangerous vaccines are suppressed. Furthermore, physicians are led to believe that the newest technology is superior to anything else, despite the dangers, since they are both funded, which we'll discuss in further detail, by these drug companies and are, quote, "swayed by prestigious medical school faculty to learn to prescribe these drugs without good evidence of effectiveness," end quote. That's Dr. Angel again. For further evidence on how these drug companies purposely misrepresent the effectiveness of the drugs, see Lancet, one of the leading medical journals, recent article exposing the real effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines and the drug company's promotion and publication of what's called relative risk reduction, RRR, and the purposeful suppression of the absolute risk reduction, ARR, to give the appearance that these vaccines are more effective than they really are. Concerning the corruption that arises from drug companies funding doctors, Dr. Angel explains that, quote, "Most doctors take money or gifts from drug companies in one way or another. No one really knows like the total amount provided by drug companies, physicians, but she says, I estimate from the annual reports of the top 9 US drug companies that it comes to tens of billions of dollars per year. The conclusion arrived at is that the pharmaceutical industry through funding has, quote, gained enormous control over how doctors evaluate and use their own products. Its extensive ties to physicians, particularly senior faculty at prestigious medical schools, affect results of research, the way medicine is practiced, and even the definition of what constitutes as disease, end quote. These conflicts of interest and biases that result in corrupted science and medicine are not restricted to psychiatry alone. And the causes of corruption are not limited to only drug companies. Quote, she says, similar conflicts of interest and biases exist virtually in every field of medicine, particularly those that rely heavily on drugs or devices. Consequently, Dr. Angel explains, quote, it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines, end quote. However, related to COVID policies, I argue substantial drastic measures requires substantial evidence, which, having considered just a few of the aforementioned points, is far from insufficient for such drastic measures. Furthermore, since drug companies have perfected a new and highly effective method to expand their markets, where instead of, she says, promoting drugs to treat diseases, they've begun to promote diseases to fit their drugs, a strategy to convince as many people as possible, along with the doctors, of course, that they have a medical conditions that require long-term drug treatment, end quote. Then I argue we have more than enough evidence and reason to think that the science and data on COVID is being manipulated for financial benefit. Moreover, there are countless examples of top research and publications admitting to fraudulent findings and publications. One recent example is the Lancet Journal, again, the most respected peer-reviewed journal of medicine, Richard Horton, admitting in 2015 that, quote, much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, is simply untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. End quote. Dr. John Ioannidis, one of the world's leading experts on medical research, adds to this, stating that 90% of medical research is tainted, if not outright bogus, due to the influence from industry. Therefore, again, we have substantial evidence just on the basis of the relationship between the drug companies and the doctors alone, as pointed out, for establishing corruption in research, medicine, and science that would make the official narrative on COVID highly dubitable, wouldn't you say? Now let us consider how drug companies play a part of technocracy and the cronyism with other entities that not only compound the problem of corruption in science and medicine. Given that technocracy is the tendency for political power to graduate to technological elites, such that science and technology become autonomous, making politics a function of systemic structural determinants over which it has little or no control, we can see how the cooperation among various institutions, including big tech, education, GAFAM, big pharma, the medical establishment, corporations, financial institutions, foundations, media, Hollywood, the music industry, even nation states, becomes important in attempting to solve social, economic, ecological, and health issues related to COVID globally, which lends itself to global governments through the cooperation of various transnational actors as a solution to both local and global problems. As Klaus Schwab states concerning global governments and technocracy, quote, global governments is commonly defined as the process of cooperation among transnational actors aimed at providing responses to global problems, those that affect more than one state or region. It encompasses the totality of institutions, policies, norms, procedures, and initiatives through which nation states tried to bring more predictability and stability to their responses to transnational challenges. This definition makes it clear that any global effort on any global issue or concern is bound to be toothless without the support and cooperation of national governments and their ability to act and legislate to support their aims. Nation states make global governments possible. One leads the other, which is why the UN says that, quote, effective global governments can only be achieved with effective international cooperation, end quote. The two notions of global governments and international cooperation are so intertwined that it's nigh on impossible for global governments to flourish in a divided world that is retrenching and fragmenting, end quote. So that's from COVID-19, the Great Reset, Klaus Schwab. It's important to understand that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. As we've been seeing from what we just discussed, it's embedded within certain socio-political structures and operates on the assumptions of these dominating ideologies. Therefore, science ought to be assessed in light of the current Gnostic technocracy and its philosophy, scientism, and the technocratic image of man in future society. An overall ideology that results in control, conflicts of interest, biases, the favoring of sponsors, drugs, and research, the suppression of contrary evidence, and the various other corruptions which permeate the scientific and medical fields. Again, scientific analysis at the paradigmatic level will inevitably involve epistemological questions. Relating to the original discussion presented earlier, our epistemological concerns ultimately turn on issues of trust, right? This means that the recent problems observed with nutritional science, climate change, and COVID science must be assessed within the context of the dominating technocratic philosophy. We must ask ourselves, can the science be corrupted by the socio-political authority of that technocracy? Can scientific consensus be trusted in light of this? And does it make certain scientific claims dubitable or highly suspect? Understanding this within the context of the current Gnostic technocratic totalitarian system, cronyism that I previously mentioned and outlined, we find much of the problems are not simply due to small sample sizes, error, invalid exploratory analysis. Our scientific judgments and procedures can indeed be corrupted by what Michael Polanyi calls the specific authority of our dominating technocratic Gnostic system. For instance, the Gnostic technocratic system can determine the overall scientific narrative and promulgate these ideas through political structures, through the media, through academia, corporations, WHO, Davos, et cetera. Something that John Gunnell actually points out in his article, who are managed and controlled by the technocratic elite. Of course, social feeling, don't forget to add that in from Saint-Simon and Kant, that becomes necessary to control and determine people's thoughts and actions, i.e. a manufactured consent, as Noam Chomsky puts it. Right? In fact, this Gnostic concealment tactic of social feeling has been recently used to shut down questions concerning whether is COVID a pandemic, whether the numbers and data are accurate, are they inflated, whether the tests are reliable, whether the proposed solutions have or will work, whether there is corruption, manipulation of the collected data, et cetera. We're all given the right pseudoscientific non-falsifiable responses to many of these questions. Well, obviously it didn't work because we weren't locked down long enough. You weren't wearing your mask, right? Well, why are the influenza down? Because we were wearing our masks. Bingo, ding, ding, ding. Another indicator that we might have something moving out of science and no longer science. These are essential signs of modern Gnostic system. As Vogelin pointed out, of course, this doesn't mean that at times we don't actually do good science. However, it does illustrate, right, how science can be corrupted, how it can become dubitable and untrustworthy. We have reasons to hold these people suspect. Oh, sorry, I missed that. Let's return back to our detective and legal analogy, shall we? For investigating the truth and trustworthiness of official story about COVID-19 pandemic. Let us summarize the preponderance of circumstantial evidence. What's that? Suspects, behavior, money, motives, rewards, beneficiaries, social control, history of repeated behavior, anticipation, or prediction, et cetera. Hey, look, if a suspect or a group of suspects act like they're guilty, intimidating witnesses, censoring, demonetizing, deplatforming, attacking critics as conspiracy theorists, concealing or destroying evidence, constantly changing the story or alibi, well, they're probably guilty, right? Or at least they're covering up for somebody, right? Furthermore, it's not only when we have evidence of prior crimes, lying or manipulating data, but when we can discover that accomplice or collaborator benefits financially or politically in terms of increased power, control, established motive, then we have additional evidence and reasons to hold that these persons as suspects or groups, if very wealthy and powerful group of people, e.g. Bill Gates, the WHO, the World Economic Forum, et cetera, who strangely predict with amazing great detail the COVID-19 pandemic will occur, providing the precise and exact matching details, both with regard to how it will play out and how the social political responses will go, including how big media is to respond in dealing with such a pandemic. You might know this as the exercise event in 201. Also, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security document the SPARS pandemic 225-28 that was written in 2017. Then we have even more evidence that a crime has been committed. Look, in a legal case, this would be akin to finding someone who supposedly wrote a fictional story about a murder, whose story describes in such great detail just such a fictional crime, only to discover an actual murder, right? That strangely matches in striking exactness and detail. Oh, and somehow it's connected also to the author who was already being held suspect, like with suspicion of committing just such a crime. Taking into account all that evidence, together with the fact that many of these foundations are funding journalism in major media corporations. In fact, Bill Gates here grants $250 million has been given to the following major corporations from Bill Gates: BBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, ProPublica, National Journal, The Guardian, Univision, Medium, The Financial Times, The Atlantic, The Texas Tribune, Gannett, Washington Monthly, Le Monde, PBS NewsHour, the Center for Investigating Reporting. Now, the various, also on top of that, transnational actors mentioned, corporations, foundations, governments, media, tech, et al., that all share a common goal, common ideology, and benefit financially from cooperating with each other. Remember, financial motive. Together with the discovery that the underlying commitment to scientism is precisely what makes it possible to manufacture consent and corrupt science, we have more than enough reasons to doubt the official narrative concerning COVID-19.